That night, the ghost warriors rose again. By dawn, blood would stain the soil, but no one knew who would survive and who would live only in legend. The sun had set. The storm was roaring. For 8 years, Ethan Hale had only spoken to his horses and the wind. He was holed up in a rotting log cabin, living a reclusive life, bearing the past in solitude. Each bullet of rain hammered on the roof like a war drum, a relentless reminder of nature's brutality, as well as the horrific memories he had endured. Every drop was a silent vow never to trust another human soul, never to open his heart to anyone. It was this suspicion and pain that had turned him into a ghost. But tonight, something knocked. 10 ghostly Comanche women, trembling with terror. The sound was not a greeting, but a desperate plea from those with nowhere left to go. Ethan froze, his gnarled hands still clutching an old piece of leather. Nobody ever came to this ranch, not anymore. Not since he had made it abundantly clear that Ethan Hale wanted nothing to do with the outside world. The knocking came again, more urgently this time, accompanied by strange voices he recognized but hadn't heard in years. Comanche. The blood in his veins ran cold. The last time he heard that tongue, his wife and daughter were still alive. The last time strangers came to his cabin at night, he buried everything he loved by morning. His hand instinctively reached for the Winchester rifle hanging above the fireplace. His muscles remembered the long nights of sleeping with one eye open, but something held him back. Perhaps it was the tone of their voices, not the war cries of warriors, but a fragile, desperate plea. Or perhaps it was the wind carrying their broken, whispered words. But more than anything, he knew that true warriors didn't knock. He approached the heavy oak door cautiously, each step measured and deliberate. Through the thick wood, he could hear the women's voices more clearly. One voice stood out, speaking English with a heavy, strained accent. "Please, we know you're in there. We need shelter, just for one night." Ethan pressed his palm against the door, feeling the vibration of her words. 8 years of solitude had taught him to trust his gut, and his gut was screaming danger, not from the women, but from whatever had driven them here in the middle of a storm that could kill a man in minutes. Ethan remembered his late wife, Clara, who used to scold him for his mistrust of strangers. She said that kindness was the only thing that separated men from animals. But Clara was dead, and kindness had died with her on a morning when he had put his trust in the wrong men. The voice came again, closer now, as if the woman's face was pressed against the door. "They're coming. If you don't help us, we will die. And when they find our bodies at your gate, you will die too." Ethan's hand hovered over the iron bolt of the door. For 8 years, he had never opened it for anyone. But there was something in that voice, a certainty that twisted his gut, a promise that tonight everything was about to change. Because somewhere in the darkness, horsemen were closing in. And when they arrived, there would be no going back to the hidden life he had built in the shadows. The iron bolt felt heavier than usual. As Ethan finally lifted it from its latch, 8 years of rust and fear seemed to fight against his decision. But the sheer desperation in the woman's voice cut through his defenses like a sharp knife. The door creaked open, revealing a sight that would haunt him for the rest of his life. 10 Comanche women huddled on the porch, their traditional clothes tattered and caked in mud, some of them wounded, their blood staining the wet fabric. The youngest was perhaps no older than 16, clutching a small bundle of cloth, a baby barely breathing in the cold. The oldest had a wisp of gray in her hair and eyes that had seen too much death. But it was the woman who had spoken to him through the door who held his full attention. She stood slightly apart, her chin held high despite the sheer exhaustion etched on her face. Blood trickled from a cut over her left eyebrow. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, but her eyes held his unflinching. "I am Zora," she said, her English careful but clear. "These are my sisters, my daughters, my people. We have been running for 3 days." Ethan's mouth opened to speak and then closed. 1,000 questions tumbled through his mind. Where had they come from? Why were they alone? What kind of men were hunting them? But the image of the baby's pale lips stopped his words. There were things more important than answers. "Get in," he heard himself say, stepping back from the doorway. As quick as shadows, they swept past him into the warmth of the room. Ethan had forgotten how small his cabin felt with other people in it. For 8 years, it had been his fortress, his sanctuary from a world that had taken everything. Now it seemed to shrink before these women who carried with them the smell of rain, fear, and something else. The coppery scent of blood that was not entirely their own. Zora was the last to enter, and as she brushed past him, she spoke in a voice barely a whisper. "The soldiers hunting us, they are not far. Maybe an hour, maybe less. They will not stop until every one of us is dead." Ethan closed the door and relatched the bolt, knowing it was probably useless now. His sanctuary had been breached, not by force, but by a choice, and there would be consequences. There always were. "Why?" he asked, turning to face Zora. "Why are they hunting you?" Her dark eyes met his, and in them he saw a familiar pain, the look of a person who had lost everything and lived to tell about it. "Because we ran instead of dying quietly. Because we chose to live when they wanted us to accept death. Because a few of us fought back when they burned our villages and killed our men." The baby in the young woman's arms let out a feeble cry. Zora's jaw tightened. "And because one of their officers will not want anyone alive to tell what he did to my youngest sister." A cold feeling settled in Ethan's stomach. He knew men like that. Men who wore uniforms but had forgotten what honor meant. Men who took what they wanted and killed anyone who might speak of it later. "How many are coming?" he asked. 8, maybe 10. Led by a Captain Sterling, he's been hunting Comanche villages for months, claiming we are enemies. But his real enemy is anyone who can report his true nature. Ethan moved to a window, looking through a crack in the shutter into the roaring darkness. Nothing was moving that he could see, but that meant nothing. Professional killers knew how to move unseen, especially when they thought their prey was cornered. He turned back to look at the women huddled by the fire. Some were tending to wounds while others comforted the youngest child. They looked like survivors, not warriors. But he had learned long ago that in order to survive, sometimes a man had to become something he never intended to be. "There's a root cellar under the kitchen," he told Zora. "Stone walls, a secret entrance. It could hold all of you, but it would be a tight fit." She shook her head slowly. "If they find us, you will die with us. If they find an empty cabin with signs of a struggle, they might believe you are not involved. We will not make you an enemy of the United States Army." Ethan almost laughed. "Too late, ma'am. I became their enemy the day I decided to live through what they did to my family. The question now is whether we run or make them pay for coming here." A light flickered in Zora's eyes. Surprise, understanding, perhaps even hope. Outside, the storm was beginning to weaken, and with it, the veil that had protected them until now was beginning to lift. Because from a distance, barely audible over the fading wind, came the sound of hooves squelching through the mud, and the low murmur of men who thought they had their prey cornered. The sound of approaching hooves sliced through the storm like a death sentence. Ethan moved with the efficiency of a man who had survived by thinking 3 steps ahead. He grabbed his rifle and a box of ammunition from a cabinet. But as he turned back to look at the women, he saw something that made him stop dead in his tracks. Zora was no longer the desperate refugee who had begged at his door. She stood ramrod straight, her posture regal, and in her hand was a knife that shimmered with more than just the firelight. The other women had also changed. Some held weapons that had been hidden under their tattered dresses. Others took up positions with the practiced ease of those who had fought before. "You're not helpless," Ethan said, the realization washing over him. "We were never helpless," Zora replied, her voice as hard as the steel in her hand. "But sometimes it is better to let a man think what he wants to think." Captain Sterling thinks he is hunting frightened women who will cower and beg. He is about to learn otherwise. The youngest woman holding the baby had quietly moved toward the back of the cabin, with 2 others following her. They knew what they were doing, had planned for this moment. Ethan realized he was not just sheltering refugees. He was sheltering warriors who had been playing a longer game than he could have ever imagined. "How many have you killed?" he asked Zora flat out. Her dark eyes met his without a hint of shame. "Enough to know that Sterling's men are not the first to underestimate a Comanche woman. They will not be the last, but they will likely be the most surprised." Outside, the voices grew clearer. Men were calling out to each other over the dying rain, coordinating their attack. Ethan could make out at least 6 distinct voices, maybe more. Professional soldiers, but operating in a land they did not understand, hunting a prey that they had judged completely wrong. "The root cellar," Ethan began, but Zora shook her head. "We run now. They hunt us forever. We hide. They search until they find. But if we end this here tonight, the hunt is over." Ethan felt something he hadn't in 8 years, that cold stillness that comes before violence, when survival pushes aside everything but what must be done. These women had not come to his ranch by chance. They had chosen this land, this night, this storm. They had brought the war to his doorstep because they knew exactly the kind of man he had been. "What do you need me for?" he asked. Zora's smile was as sharp as her blade. "Captain Sterling expects to find helpless women. Instead, he will find us. But when his men see a white rancher fighting alongside Comanches, they will hesitate. That hesitation will cost them everything." A horse neighed near the cabin, and the heavy sound of boots squelched through the mud outside. Someone was moving around the house, checking escape routes, planning their assault. In a few more minutes, they would be inside, expecting to find cowering victims. Ethan checked his rifle, making sure there was a round in the chamber. Clara's voice echoed in his memory, reminding him that kindness was what separated them from animals. But kindness, he was learning, sometimes wore the face of violence when it was the only thing that stood between innocence and evil. "There is one other thing," Zora said softly. "When this is over, if we survive, you cannot stay here. Sterling's death will bring questions, investigations. They will come looking for answers." Ethan nodded. He had known that the moment he opened the door. 8 years of peace would end tonight. But perhaps it was meant to be that way. Perhaps some men are not meant to hide from the world forever. Outside, a voice rang out over the storm, full of power, arrogance, and the certainty of victory. "I know you're in there. Come out now and we'll make this quick." Captain Sterling had arrived, and he was about to discover that some hunts end with the hunter becoming the prey. Ethan took a position at the front window while Zora and 3 other women spread out across the main room, hidden in the shadows cast by the dying fire. The remaining women had disappeared into the back of the cabin, creating multiple lines of defense that would disorient any assault. "Rancher," Sterling's voice rang out again, "we are in pursuit of dangerous fugitives. Open the door or we will assume you are harboring enemies of the United States." Through the curtains, Ethan could see shapes moving in the darkness. Soldiers were fanning out around the cabin, taking up positions to prevent escape. Standard military tactics, but they were operating under false assumptions. They thought they were cornering a cabin full of frightened women and perhaps a sympathetic rancher. Zora appeared next to him, moving so silently that he hadn't heard her approach. "The soldier by the corral," she whispered. "That is Corporal Blake. He was there when they killed my husband." "The soldier by the well, that is Private Hayes. He held my sister while Morrison—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Ethan felt something dark and familiar well up in his chest. That cold anger was the same thing that had sustained him through 8 years of solitude. These were no longer soldiers. They were predators in uniform, and predators only understand one language. "How do you want to do this?" he asked. Zora's smile was as sharp as her blade. "Sterling will come through the front door. He always wants to see the fear in his victims' eyes. His men will flank the back and sides, but they expect to find women too scared to fight and a rancher too scared to resist." She handed him something, a small polished piece of mirror. "When you see the signal, take care of Sterling. We will take care of the rest." Ethan was about to ask what signal when a new voice came over the storm. A young voice, unsure, not like the hard commands they had been hearing. "Captain, maybe we should just search and go. Could be just an old rancher riding out the storm." Sterling's laugh was ugly. "Private Wilson, the tracks lead right to this door. 10 women moving fast, bleeding in at least 3 places. They are in there, and so is whatever fool was stupid enough to help them. We play by the rules, my rules." Ethan heard the click of rifles being readied, the sound of safety catches being flipped. Whatever was about to happen, it was going to happen now. The front door exploded inward as Sterling kicked it, his rifle held high and ready. But instead of finding cowering women, he found himself staring down the barrel of Ethan's Winchester. For a split second, confusion flashed across the captain's face. Things were not supposed to happen like this. That moment of hesitation was all Zora needed. The mirror flashed in the firelight, a signal sent to the other positions in the cabin. The storm that had concealed the soldiers' approach now muffled the sounds of what was happening, the choked groans of men dying before they could even scream. The wet sound of justice being meted out by Comanche steel. Sterling's eyes widened as he understood he had walked into a trap, but the understanding came too late. Ethan's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could fire, Zora appeared behind the captain like a shadow. "This is for my sister," she whispered in Sterling's ear, her knife sliding between his ribs with pinpoint accuracy. Sterling dropped his rifle, clutching the wound. But Zora wasn't finished. She wanted him to see her face, to know who had brought him justice. "And this is for every woman you thought was too weak to fight back." But as Sterling collapsed, a new sound came over the storm. More horses, more voices. Sterling hadn't come alone. Somewhere in the darkness, reinforcements were closing in. And the real battle was only just beginning. The sound of the approaching reinforcements made Ethan's blood run cold. Through the broken door, he could see torches dancing in the darkness. At least a dozen cavalrymen, maybe more. Sterling had been the vanguard, not the main force. The real army was coming. Zora pulled her knife from Sterling's chest, her face turning grim as she recognized what they were hearing. All around the cabin, her women appeared from the shadows like ghosts, each one confirming what Ethan already knew. Sterling's squad was dead, but their victory had lasted exactly 30 seconds. "How many?" Zora asked the woman who appeared at her side. 15 cavalrymen, maybe 20. They heard the gunshot. They know something is wrong." Ethan felt the weight of impossible choices settling on his shoulders. Fight and die, or surrender and die more slowly. But as he looked at these women who had turned his sanctuary into a battlefield, he realized there was a third option, one that required him to become the man he had once been before the pain had turned him into a recluse. "The dam," he said quickly, "not to hide, but to survive what's coming." Zora shook her head. "We cannot run from that many men. They will hunt us across 3 territories." "We are not running," Ethan replied, moving toward a cabinet he hadn't opened in 8 years. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were things he had hoped he would never have to touch again. Dynamite, fuses, the tools of a man who had once leveled mountainsides to lay track, and then other things when the war demanded it. "My ranch is on a ridge," he explained, his hands automatically setting up the explosive blocks. "The natural runoff of the rain comes down on either side. When the spring floods come, all that water has to go somewhere." Understanding dawned in Zora's eyes. "The dam," Ethan nodded. "I built it to control the flooding, but blowing it in a storm like this?" He gestured toward the approaching torches. "That valley will be 10 feet deep in water in a few minutes. Anyone caught in it will die," Zora finished, "but we would destroy your home, your land." Ethan looked around the cabin that had been his prison for 8 years, then at the cooling body of Sterling on the floor. Home wasn't a place anymore. It was a choice, and his choice was to make sure these women survived. "Some things are more important than property," he said, echoing words Clara had once said when he had been too attached to material things. Outside, the voices were getting closer, commands being yelled, positions being taken. Someone had found Sterling's body, seen the blood, and understood that their easy prey had become something else entirely. The youngest woman appeared with the baby, the child having somehow slept through the violence. But now the child was awake, wide-eyed and alert, as if sensing the tension filling the air. "Captain Sterling is dead," a voice from outside yelled. "Surrender now or we will burn you out." Zora looked at Ethan, her expression unreadable. "If we do this, there is no going back. You will be a wanted man for the rest of your life." Ethan hoisted the rifle to his shoulder and picked up the prepared blocks of dynamite. "Ma'am, I have been a dead man for 8 years. Tonight I am choosing to live again." But as they moved to leave through the back entrance, a new sound stopped them. The cry of a baby. Not the baby in their arms, but another one somewhere out in the storm. One of the soldiers had brought a child, because sometimes the worst monsters hide behind the most innocent shields, and the hardest choices are the ones that test how far a man will go to save the ones who matter most. That distant baby's cry changed everything. Ethan froze halfway to the back door. The block of dynamite suddenly felt like lead in his hand. Through the shattered front entrance, torchlight flickered on Sterling's corpse, and somewhere beyond that light, an innocent child was caught in a war that was not its own. Zora grabbed his arm, her grip as firm as steel. It could be a trick. Soldiers have used things like that before. But Ethan shook his head. He had heard too many real cries of terror in his life to mistake the genuine horror in that small voice. Someone out there, perhaps one of Sterling's men, had brought their child on a mission they expected to be a simple massacre. Now that child was about to pay for its father's sins. "We can't blow the dam," he said quietly. "Not with a baby down there." "Then we all die," one of the other women hissed. "My daughter's life is just as important as that child." She was right, and Ethan knew it. But some lines, once crossed, change a man forever. He had walked that line for 8 years, and tonight he was either going to step back from it or fall completely over. "There's another way," he said, setting the dynamite down. "Harder, more dangerous, but it keeps everyone alive." Zora's eyes narrowed. "Tell me." "We make them think we're trapped. We make them overconfident. They'll send men in to flush us out while the rest stay with the horses and—" He paused. "And whoever brought that baby, that leaves us outnumbered 3-1. In a fair fight, yes, but this won't be a fair fight." Ethan moved to another cabinet. This one held items that spoke of a different kind of war. Steel spikes, iron caltrops designed to puncture a horse's foot, tripwires that could snap a man's neck in the darkness, bear traps that had never seen a bear, but had tasted human flesh in the war. 8 years ago, I turned this place into a fortress because I was afraid of dying. Tonight we will use those same defenses to make sure someone else lives. Outside, the voices were reorganizing. Someone was taking command, perhaps Sterling's second in command. Orders were being barked, positions assigned. They had numbers and training, but they were operating in the dark on a land Ethan knew as well as his own heartbeat. "How do we split them?" Zora asked. "We give them what they expect, a final stand. We barricade the front door, make a lot of noise, make them think we're cornered and desperate. Half their force will come to find us. The other half will stay behind to guard their retreat. And then," Ethan smiled. It was not a pleasant expression, "we show them the difference between hunting frightened women and fighting men who have nothing left to lose." The plan was simple, brutal, and completely insane. Zora and 4 of the women would create a diversion at the front of the house, making enough noise to draw the assault team. Meanwhile, Ethan and the remaining women would circle around through a patch of land only he knew, aiming for the reserve force and hoping to get the baby to safety. "If this fails," Zora said as they prepared to split up, "Sterling's death will mean nothing. They will paint us as savage murderers and use our bodies to justify 10 more raids." "And if we do nothing," Ethan replied, "that baby out there dies for its father's sins, and you all die for wanting to live. Sometimes the only choice is between bad and worse." The baby's cry came again, weaker this time, and Ethan felt time slipping like water through his fingers. Every second they delayed was a second closer to a child's death. One more moment that would haunt him if he survived this night. "Let's go," he whispered. As Zora and her team took up positions at the front of the cabin, Ethan led the others into the storm through the back door. The rain had lessened, but the ground was slick, and one wrong move would alert the soldiers to their attack. Dawn broke over Ethan Hale's ranch, painting the sky in a fiery blaze of orange and red, a stark contrast to the darkness that had just passed. Ethan stood on the muddy porch as Zora and the remaining Comanche women prepared their horses, their movements silent and efficient. They had won, but the victory came at a price. The cabin was a wreck, its walls scarred with bullet holes, its floor stained with blood. His sanctuary was gone. The baby who had been brought by the soldier was safe, now in the arms of one of Zora's women. As for the Comanche child, she was now resting peacefully, oblivious to the battle that had raged around her. "Where will you go?" Ethan asked Zora, his voice rough with exhaustion. "North," she replied, her eyes meeting his. "To the mountains where we can be free. We will rebuild." A small smile touched her lips. "And what about you? The man who lived alone for 8 years. He died tonight." Ethan looked around the ruined home that had been his prison. "Yes," he said softly. "He did. The man who was left behind is gone." He turned back to her. "I think I will go west. Find a place that needs a man who isn't afraid to protect things." Zora nodded slowly. "The world is big, Ethan Hale. Perhaps our paths will cross again." She turned to mount her horse, her gaze unwavering. "And when people ask about this night, tell them a story." She rode off, her sisters and the 2 children following behind her. Ethan stood there watching them disappear into the mist. He felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in nearly a decade. The ghosts of his past were finally gone. 2 hours later, a full regiment of cavalrymen, led by a colonel, found the scene. They dismounted slowly, their faces grim as they surveyed the chaos. Bodies lay in the mud, rifles scattered on the ground, and the front of the cabin was a splintered wreck. They found Captain Sterling's body near the entrance, a knife wound in his heart. No sign of the Comanche women, no sign of the rancher. The colonel bent down, his eyes fixed on a single detail, a knife, beautifully crafted with a feather tied to its handle, buried deep in the rotting wood of the porch. It was unlike any weapon he had ever seen. He touched the feather, and a cold shiver ran down his spine. "What in God's name happened here?" the colonel muttered, his voice echoing in the eerie quiet. A young private looked around, his face pale with a mixture of fear and awe. "It looks like they just vanished, sir." The colonel shook his head, a cold feeling settling in his gut. He had heard whispers of the ghost warriors, but had dismissed them as old wives' tales. Now he wasn't so sure. He looked at the ruined cabin, at the dead bodies of his men, and then to the vast, empty wilderness. He turned back to the knife, its feather still trembling slightly in the morning breeze. He said nothing more, and in the distance a lone eagle cried out. The sun, a burning eye in the sky, slowly began to swallow the long shadows cast by his horse, by the dead men, and by the ruined cabin, leaving only the endless land.